Fear is the worst feeling imaginable. Being found has got to be one of the best realities we can ever experience. It was 10 or 11 years ago now, on a Sabbath afternoon, our family decided to go to the beach with some friends for a walk and to entertain the kids for the afternoon. We went to Karatahi Beach, which is a rugged black sand west coast beach. It has waves that suit surfers more than small children, and you're allowed to ride motorbikes and horses along the beach. We chose to go to that beach because Richard's brother and his family were joining us that day, and their 5-year-old son Ryan had a new little motorbike to ride. So we'd been there for an hour or so when all of a sudden someone realised that no one had seen Ryan for a while. And initially we were calm, we just decided to have a look around and we all went our various ways. But the longer it took, the more fear we felt and the more intense the search got. You see, there's no cell phone reception out at the beach, and so we couldn't talk to each other while we were searching. And so a few minutes in, we had called the surf lifesavers to help, and so they were racing up and down the beach on their 4-wheeler motorbikes as well. And the rest of the guys had asked Bridget and I to stay with the rest of the children and wait and so that we didn't lose any more children, but also wait in case Ryan came back. If you're like me, you would rather be searching than waiting. Waiting is not fun. It makes you feel so incredibly helpless, and your mind races to every possible outcome, and that's what we did on a beach that had really rough surf that day, that had guys on motorbikes that we didn't know, and our fear increased the longer we waited. And so after waiting a while, we decided to gather the kids together to pray. Now, I'm not necessarily proud of this, but I was afraid to have a public prayer with the kids asking God to bring Ryan back, because how do you explain it to them if he doesn't? But we chose to pray anyway. And we stood in a circle with the kids, and Bridget and I both prayed. And the moment we finished, I'll never forget it, Jess, who was the oldest child there that day, opened her eyes and with childlike faith said, "Well, we've prayed to Jesus, so we'll find him now." I remember Bridget and I just looking at each other, unsure how to respond. But as we turned around, it was instant. Way off in the distance, we could see a little person walking slowly towards us, pushing a motorbike. You see, he'd ridden all the way down the beach and he'd run out of petrol. And he was having to push his bike back through the sand. Everyone there just started running full steam towards him, and as we got closer, we saw that he had tears streaming down his face, just like the ones on ours. The joy and relief and peace that comes when we are found. What if it's always been God's plan that every person be transformed from living with fear to being found? And what if there's a pathway to discover that? Our series Found is based on the book that was originally called The Hidden Power of the Gospels by Alexander Shire. Alexander has a degree in cultural anthropology. He has a master's degree in counselling education. He has a master's degree in religious education. He has a graduate certificate in pastoral psychotherapy and a PhD in clinical psychology. So I'm not sure why I thought I would even understand this guy's book or where he found the time to discover and write what he did. But clearly he's a very smart man. And his book, as the title would suggest, revolves around the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if I could encourage you to do anything over this series, it would be over the next couple of weeks to read those Gospels again and to think about it from the perspective that we're talking about today. One of the things I learnt was that when these books were written, they were read as one gospel. They are not 4 books, they are one story of spirit and transformation. And the sequence of the books is actually Matthew, Mark, John, and then Luke. What Alexander discovered was that embedded in these books are the 4 seasons of our faith journey with God and the 4 questions relating to those seasons. I mean, we know that life circles around 4 seasons, but our walk with God revolves around 4 questions related to those seasons. And God revealed that pattern in the Gospels. So Matthew, he likens to autumn, and he asks the question in and through Matthew, how do we face change? In Mark, he likens it to winter, and he asks the question in that book, how do we move through suffering, through obstacles and through conflict? John is like spring and asks the question, how do we receive joy? And Luke is summer. And summer asks the question, how do we mature in service? Or how do we live out our walk with God? How do we live Isaiah 58? Whether we like it or not, we all experience these 4 seasons. King Solomon, said to be the wisest man who ever lived, wrote in Ecclesiastes 3 that there is a time for everything. There is a season for every activity on earth. We experience change and doubt. We are hit with troubles. We're hit with conflict and suffering. And we experience joy. We have aha moments, and we live day by day based on how we walk through our autumn, our winter, and our spring. And I guess over this series, we just want to ask us to identify the season that we're in and how we can make the most of that season, even if we don't particularly like that we're in it. This week we're going to have a closer look at Matthew and Mark, and next week Carl is going to unpack John and Luke. We'll look at the season each book speaks to and the questions that they circle around and how it's all still relevant for us today. So because we know Matthew, Mark, John and Luke are one gospel, that makes Matthew the first chapter or the first installment. Matthew is thought to be written around 60 to 65 AD. It was a time when people thought it was about to be the end of the world. It was written 4 or 5 years after the destruction of the temple, and the temple was literally their whole world. It was the promise of the presence of God. They literally thought it was the end of the world. But our endings, when a chapter closes in our lives, we need to remember that that also creates new life. It creates new beginnings, new breath, and the potential to transform, just like a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. Alexander likens Matthew to autumn, and in autumn we see nature die. We see life end. But that doesn't make us sad. It actually has the opposite effect. There's such beauty in autumn as nature turns orange and gold and falls to the ground. And we know that although part of life is ending, it also births something new. We see it everywhere. Things ending, situations changing, people leaving. But instead of living in fear, what if we instead could feel peace? What if we felt an expectancy or even a little bit of excitement? When we have a baby, our couple life ends. We lose some freedom, but family begins and the joy that comes with that. When high school ends, uni or a course or a job begins. It's a bit scary, but it's also exciting. When our babies leave home or they get some freedom. My youngest got her license this week. It's like that kind of brings freedom and fear all at the same time. Careers change, our families grow and change, we grow and change. Every chapter in life comes to an end, and it's important to acknowledge and accept that, to walk away and move forward when something reaches its conclusion. Closing the door, turning the page, moving forward, it doesn't matter what we call it. What matters is that we leave the past where it belongs, so that we can make the best of the life that is still available to us to be lived. The endings we experience are not the end. It's just our life beginning again in a new way. It's a point in our story where one chapter transitions or transforms into the next. In Matthew, we see it right from the beginning. He starts in a place that we generally skip because we think it has no relevance. It starts with genealogy, the lineage of Jesus. Can you imagine if I now began to share with you the names of my ancestors for the last 6,000 years? It's the best sermon ever. But Jesus' genealogy is a reminder of where life fell apart, where life ended but began again. Jesus' ancestors include Tamar. Tamar dressed like a prostitute to sleep with her father. Jacob was a thief. David was a murderer and an adulterer. This is our story. End times are not end times. That's not our story. End times are just the beginning. We see it in Matthew's reference to the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, and he repeats that over and over again. And the purpose of giving example after example is to tear down walls. You see, they thought that God dwelt in the temple, which made their building special. But God turned that thinking, or Matthew in that book turned that thinking upside down. He tells us that the temple is a person that we can all access. It was the end of something sacred for something real. It was the end of something sacred for the source. And they had to tear down their idea of what a king looked like. They thought that the king would come and conquer and destroy their enemies, that he would reign. But they had to put that idea to death. They had to realize that the king that had come was the exact opposite of what they thought. The king that they got was humble. He was a servant leader. He was compassionate and he was kind. He was a king who saw the least of those. And he called those people who were stuck in tradition and those stuck in religion. And he called them to focus on their actions instead of their knowledge. We see it in the story of Mary and Joseph in Matthew. Jesus' parents who had everything going for them. And now Mary is pregnant. A priestly woman. Her life is completely trashed. She'd have thought life was over. And Joseph had a huge dilemma too. You know, would he stay with her? Would he accept the call that God was placing on his life? Because if he did, what that meant is that he would have to go against everything he had ever been taught. He'd have to go against his family and his rabbi, and he'd have to choose to follow a new message, a new grace, a new story in his life. And Joseph, in following God's call, he broke religious and traditional laws that he thought would never be broken, because he instead chose to follow the God inside him. Matthew challenges our thinking. He challenges our traditions and our beliefs. He lets us know that questions are okay. Change is okay. Doubt is okay. He asks the question, how in this darkness, in this change, and in this season can I see God? How can I hear God? There's an Arabic saying that says, don't seek to know what the ancients knew, seek the source. We have to go to the source and speak to him. That's the power of the gospel, church, that we can speak directly to God. But to do that, we've got to wade through what we've always been told. We've got to wade through what our families believe. We have to wade through the comfort of tradition and knowledge and speak to the source, because it's only in him that we are found. So that's Matthew. How do we face change? And that leads us to Mark. So shortly after Nero had condemned the Christians to die in July of 64 AD, this next installment is written. At the time, the city is literally under condemnation of death. If you admit you're a Christian, you are put to death. And not in a kind way, not in a quick way. They would enjoy watching people in pain. They did things like feed people to hungry dogs. And they would kill children first to make their parents watch before they were killed. Mark explains how we, through the power of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, can move through suffering. Whether it's physical, spiritual, emotional, or cultural, Mark asks the question, how do we face suffering well? In this chapter, Mark, unlike Matthew, skips all the niceties. There are no prelims like there is in Matthew. He just heads straight to Jesus' baptism and temptation. No genealogy, no birth, just right into Jesus' ministry and the challenges he faced. Alexander Shire writes, Mark is one of the most disturbing and inspiring texts I know. From the first line to the last line is a teaching of Jesus. And we learn that in the middle of resurrection or victory, there is also suffering. What he's saying is that even though the victory is ours, and that's a great truth of the gospel, Jesus has already fought the battle and won. We just get to live in that reality. We get to live in that victory. But it is also true that in the middle of that victory, there exists pain. There exists hurt and suffering. And Mark begins, ends, and is filled with this theme. Right from the beginning. The first story he tells is of the temptations and the struggles that Jesus is confronted with. He then tells the story of Jesus casting out an evil spirit. And I think he begins this way to set the scene. I think he's saying that no matter how good we are, no matter where we are on our spiritual journey, no matter how faithful or smart or religious or loved we are, the devil will confront us. And he will confront us with fear, with pain, with struggle, and with grief. Mark continues with several examples, including Jesus and his disciples crossing the sea at night, the one that we looked at a couple of weeks ago in our Fear Not series. And we see it at the end of Mark, when Jesus is on the cross and he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me? Jesus there is actually quoting the beginning of Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 continues to say, why are you so far away when I cry for help? This is a psalm that begins with abandonment and despair, but it doesn't end that way. David talks about all he's facing in this psalm. He is being mocked and hunted, and he admits that he has lost his strength. But all through the same psalm, in the middle of his pain and grief, he chooses to continue to praise his God. He continues to point to the source. He says, yet you are holy. You are my strength. I will praise your name. I will tell others about you. I and my children will honor you. We will serve you, and future generations will hear how awesome you are. In and through this second installment of the gospel, we see that Jesus doesn't necessarily take away suffering. He doesn't necessarily take away fear or challenge, but he promises to be with us in and through it. He helps us see that even when we feel abandoned, he is with us. It's as if Mark is saying, I know abandonment, but I also know the source. I know the presence of God. So you know what? Bring your rage. Bring your injustice. Bring your abandonment and your anger and your inequity. Bring your doubt and your fear and your insecurities. Bring all of you to God and wrestle it out. Because we are not going to get through it with platitudes or playing nice. But we can learn how to suffer with dignity, how to live through grief and pain, how to live through oppression and betrayal with our head held high, knowing that God is with us. When we suffer well, when we do winter well, we grow and we change and we transform. And through it all, we remember that spring is coming. Just like a plant in winter, our journey with God may lie dormant for a while, but spring is coming, church. New life, new opportunities, new possibilities are on the way. If you are in a season of winter, spring is coming. I couldn't help but think when I was writing this of Pat Bolton. Pat attended Papster for a number of years, and he served on our welcoming and our car park teams in First Impressions. Pat didn't have an easy life, but you'd have never known, because Pat lived joy, he lived beauty, and he lived service to others. Pat had been an upholsterer in his life, and he'd often contact us at the church during the week, and he'd ask if there was anything he could fix, anything he could come down to do to help. I loved serving alongside Pat. He was one of those people who was always willing to step in for others, and he'd do it at short notice. I'm sure that he brightened up many of your days as you arrived at our doors each week as well. Pat was diagnosed with colon cancer. Pat was diagnosed with colon cancer at the beginning of October last year. And sadly, it progressed significantly before they found it. So Pat passed away in the same month that he found out he was unwell. I'll never forget visiting Pat at Middlemore just days before he died. He was in such good spirits. He wasn't sad. He was actually worried about us. He wanted to make sure we were comfortable while we were visiting him. He was grateful for a life well lived. He was grateful for his nurses, and you can imagine how much his nurses loved him. But most of all, he was grateful to God. He wanted to tell us what God meant to him, and he wanted us to sing hymns with him so that he could show his gratitude to God that way. Pat was connected to the source. I'll never forget the feeling I had as we walked away that day, hoping, praying, and wishing that I will one day die with such courage, with such grace, dignity, and love for my God. Pat was an awesome example of living out what the book of Mark teaches us. Matthew and Mark were written after Paul lived his ministry for 25 years. I think we sometimes read it like it's the first eyewitness account. But these first 2 chapters are written through Paul's eyes, through his knowledge and experience and connection to God. Every word is written with resurrection in mind, with new life, with victory in mind. Not just at the end of the passage. We move in and through change and suffering. We move in and through joy and service with victory in mind, because we know where the story goes, church. We know where the story ends. I think this journey looks a lot like a butterfly. Funnily enough, the butterfly has 4 stages to its transformation as well. A butterfly begins as a small egg. It then hatches into a caterpillar. And as a caterpillar, all it does is eat. So it grows and allows the 3rd stage to begin. In that 3rd stage, it forms a chrysalis. And from the outside, it looks like the caterpillar is resting. But inside is where all the action is. Inside, it is rapidly changing. As we know, caterpillars are short and they're stubby and they have no wings. But inside that chrysalis, the old body undergoes a remarkable transformation. Its tissues, limbs, and organs all change. And then it's ready for the final stage of its life cycle. Once all the forming has happened, that butterfly emerges. It pumps blood into its wings to get them working, and then it begins to fly. It doesn't matter what season we're in, church, because every season, every stage is needed before we can spread our wings and fly. But we do need to think about where we're at. Are we in a season of change, in a season of questioning or uncertainty? Maybe we're just in a season of stinking hard stuff. Maybe it just feels like the walls are caving in around us. Maybe we'll discover that we're in spring or summer, seasons of joy and service, and we'll talk about that next week. But when we've walked with God through all 4 seasons, He teaches us how to face situations well, no matter what they look like. And He reveals Himself to us in every season, so that when we reach summer, although we're still hit with challenge and change and sadness, we walk through it with victory in mind, rather than hopelessness and despair, because we're connected to the source. That's what the journey does. That's what transformation looks like. That's what the presence of God does in our lives. No matter what season we find ourselves in today, church, I want us to leave knowing without a doubt in our minds that in God's eyes, we are already found. He sees us, He knows us, and He loves us. And I believe in this journey, but I want us to know that the journey is just about us coming to know with absolute certainty that we are already found. Did you hear that? We are already found. Turn to the person next to you and say, I am found. The journey is about us discovering that we have a God who kicks down walls to find us. He climbs mountains to find us. He lights up darkness to find us. There is nothing that He doesn't do in pursuit of us. We have a God who relentlessly chases after us, no matter how much we feel or think we're hiding. He sees us. And we may forget, it may not feel like it at times, or we may think we can push Him away, but we are found. And I believe that God's plan and hope and dream is that we would know that He is always by our side, even when it doesn't feel like it. It's in those times that we just need to rely on what we know instead of what we feel. Because we are never lost in Him. We are only ever found. And the journey is just about moving towards more love, more healing, more compassion, more reconciliation, more restoration. So no matter how you feel today, church, I just want to invite you to sing and to claim these words as we finish today. God, you're so awesome. And we don't deserve you. We don't deserve the love that you throw at us over and over again. We don't deserve the lengths that you go to. But we're so grateful that you think we do. That you think we deserve that you love us, that no matter how we treat you, no matter what we think of you, that you're always just pursuing us, that you are hunting us down. And God, we're just so grateful that we are found in you. We're so grateful that you walk beside us no matter what we're going through, and that you see our pain, you see our doubt, you see us suffer, and you see us in change, you see us in our joys, and you're in and through all of it. And so God, help us to remember and to walk with you and to walk in the victory that we know that spring is coming, God, and that we know that you're always by our side. Just help us to live that way and to always know, to walk away leaving, knowing every day that we are found. We love you. Amen.